playing Ed Norton garnered 6 Emmys for Art Carney. It was Al Pacino who he lost the Oscar to. Nonetheless, he remains silent at the death of his renowned Honeymooners co-star in 1996. No one in Hollywood could not but pay homage. The family of Jackie Gleason sent flowers. On television, former cast members sobbed. Art Carney said nothing. Her memoir had described him as compassionate and smart. A possible reunion was something she wished for. It was never done. Little did anyone know the depths of the darkness that ensued between them. Art Carney came into this world in Mount Vernon, New York on November 4, 1918. He came from a very Irish Catholic home and was the youngest of 6 brothers. The booze that permeated their home like water had a greater impact on Art than his father's job as a newspaperman. Alcoholism plagued 3 of his elder brothers. Even his dad drank. According to what Art mentioned, the most of us guys didn't smoke but were heavy drinkers. Not a remark at all, it was a caution. As a teenager, he began drinking regularly, not occasionally or socially, but consistently. In his youth, he accepted drinking as an inevitable part of life. He would tumble into it, the only question was when. Early on, he showed promise. He was quite skilled at playing the role of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was truly him, he didn't only sound like him. A person's voice, a pause, and tone. Listeners on the radio mistook the president's voice for his own. Federal agents were brought in because it became so convincing. They were concerned that it could lead to misunderstandings during the conflict. Some foreign officials even thought he was giving actual speeches throughout his performance. It was risky, but it catapulted him to fame. In subsequent radio appearances, he imitated not only Roosevelt but also Churchill and Eisenhower using that voice. Thanks to his older brother, Carney was performing with the Horace Heights Orchestra by the time he was 18 years old. Vanity seemed enticing. In fact, it was not. A blind whistler named Fred Lowry lived with him. Along with coffee, he brought Art to morning beverages. Day in and day out, gin and grapefruit juice. Initially, it was liberating. A haven of rulelessness and guiltlessness, that freedom soon turned into a prison. Unbeknownst to him, he was already addicted. Clear in his mind was a single incident. During a live broadcast, he was so inebriated that he couldn't even spell the sponsor's name, Tums. The advertisement was spoken by him in a slur. The sponsors were enraged. At age 23, he quit the band just before they could terminate him. War followed. His 4th wedding anniversary was on August 15, 1944. He was a machine gunner with the 28th Infantry Division in France. Not far away, a German mortar went off. His right thigh was ripped up by shrapnel. His weapon remained unfired. In retrospect, he might have wished he had never fired a shot, he quipped. However, the harm was serious. He ended up with a right leg that was 0.5 inch shorter than his left. For the remainder of his life, he was crippled. With a Purple Heart and 9 months of recuperation under his belt, he returned home a medal winner, but with invisible wounds. He unmasked his limp. No, the trauma was. More alcohol was consumed by him. He administered barbiturates. Subsequently, he began to use amphetamines. The war itself had only been 2 months, but he felt its aftershocks for the rest of his life. He passed out at times. Under duress, he crumbled. Still, no one referred to it as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, when it occurred. He even had to leave The Odd Couple in 1965 due to a breakdown. His journey to sobriety would last nearly 3 decades following the war. There was no radio station in the late 1940s that didn't feature Carney. Along with Maury Amsterdam, he collaborated with Milton Berle and Fred Allen. He was the trusted wingman, the backup plan. Even though he was quite skilled behind the mic, he was drinking more than ever before, even though he could pull off any voice or joke. Despite his occasional blackouts and slurred speech, he was nonetheless hired. His skill was quite unusual. Instead of addressing his drinking, producers found ways to work around it. A major obstacle stood in his way following the battle. Though he was limping, he managed to find a way to succeed on television. Instead of trying to disguise his limp, he made advantage of the bespoke shoes that helped him balance his legs. He included it in his comedic routine. His peculiar gait and dance styles weren't arbitrary, they were survival techniques. He made performance out of suffering. Even as the truth pursued him, his fans remained oblivious and made fun of him. A decline occurred in sobriety. His drinking had returned with a fury, adding to his precarious situation with Horace Height's band. It wasn't a matter of personal choice when he quit the band at the age of 23. Simply put, he felt compelled to. A liability he was. He had already damaged one relationship due to his addiction. It would be followed by a great many more. He gave stand-up comedy a shot. Nothing happened. He was petrified of the stage, not because he lacked comedic timing. The anxiousness was heightened by the expressions on the faces of the throng, the relative quiet, and the mounting pressure. To soothe himself, he drank. He then took some medicines to help him focus. Even to fall asleep, he needed further medication. A vicious loop had been set up by him. Drugs, fear, humiliation, repeat. The same guy who shone a light on radio stars also flopped when thrust into the limelight. His private life was not immune either. He wed Jean Myers, the woman he had loved since high school, in 1940. James, Eileen, and Paul were their offspring. Addiction, however, eventually tore the marriage apart. Because he doubted his own worth, Art Carney nearly missed out on making television history. Carney doubted the wisdom of radio writer's 1951 suggestion that he appear in a Cavalcade of Stars comedy alongside Jackie Gleason. A star was already on the rise with Gleason. To Carney, it seemed like the famous person had no idea who he was. There was no pretense of modesty. On the Maury Amsterdam show, he had been subtly but effectively taking center stage as Newton the waiter. But he still considered himself a little player. The subsequent events would be molded by that frame of mind. A man whose talent could light up an entire room was this man. Still, he had self-doubts at every turn. Ed Norton became famous after the sketch. Became the Honeymooners. His pork pie hat, white t-shirt, and unbuttoned vest were instantly recognizable. However, there were some hiccups going on behind the scenes. Carney aspired to excellence. Every word, movement, and beat had to be practiced, in his opinion. Wanted spontaneity, Gleason. Too much practice, he thought, would destroy the magic. Carney would always be prepared to practice. Not Gleason. Consequently, Carney developed Norton's character independently. When he was wounded in battle, he even wore shoes designed to disguise his limp. Carney did all the goofy dances and had the perfect timing. Praying in solitude, propelled by stress, agony, and, in the end, medication. The time that Art Carney spent living through filming The Honeymooners was far from comical. Live taping of all 39 episodes took place in front of an audience of 1,000 at Manhattan's Adelphi Theater. It was enough pressure just from that. Things became more complicated because to Jackie Gleason. He gained fame for revising screenplays in the final hours before performances. He thought that if they practiced too much, the spontaneity would be lost. As a result, the actors frequently took the stage naively. It was excruciating for Carney. Even with his imperfection, he sought perfection. He had to get ready. On the contrary, he would receive fresh lines and stage directions right before performing in front of an actual live audience. There was an excessive amount of worry. As a means of mutual aid, the actors developed coded visual cues. When Gleason couldn't remember a line, he would pat his tummy. Anytime someone needed to go to the fridge, Audrey Meadows would sneak a peek. On screen, all appeared to be going swimmingly, but Carney was clearly struggling behind the scenes. He used drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms. Somehow to ease the mental tempest brewing within him. It seems like a tremendous hit when the show was cancelled in 1956. After falling to number 19 in the US, ratings plummeted. However, Carney felt a sense of relaxation. There will be no more panic attacks right before live tapings or last-minute rewrites. According to his manager, Gleason has other intentions, and Carney isn't one of them. Carney is also pleased by that. At last he was free, and he made the most of it. He first appeared on Broadway in 1957 in a production of The Rope Dancers. He was the drunken Father James Hyland. There were 189 performances of the play, and it was nominated for 6 Tony Awards. He was adored by critics. People thought he was a genius at blending vulnerability, sadness, and charisma. Few, however, noticed that the part was really quite easy. The heavy drinking had already begun in Carney. Years have passed. After that, he played his most famous part on stage. In Neil Simon's 1965 comedy The Odd Couple, Carney played the role of the first Felix Unger. Across from Walter Matthau. They were a great fit. Everything in Matthau was in a jumble. And Carney was spot on. Success for the show skyrocketed. They were gushing. The first and best was Tony Randall's description of Carney's performance, who went on to play Felix on television. Thanks to Carney, Felix became more than simply a neat freak. His work gave him humanity, complexity, humor, and vulnerability. Even Jack Lemmon, who played Felix in the film afterward, had trouble escaping Carney's shadow. Despite the success of his theater career, his private life was in shambles. The 25-year marriage he had been in was beginning to crumble by 1965. They were long-term friends and had 3 children together with Jean Myers. But his addictions would destroy it. In his teenage years, Carney began to partake in alcohol. He had also developed an addiction to barbiturates and amphetamines by the 1960s. An old comedy companion of his would have grapefruit juice and gin for breakfast, he confessed. Time made it worse. After years of Jean's assistance, his conduct became unpredictable and even violent. It was too much for her. Something much odd transpired in the same year when the marriage ended. A literal transformation into Felix Unger began in Carney. In his spare time, he worked on his obsessive tendencies. His habit of stacking coins was the most unsettling. Coins of all sizes, colors, and values would be neatly arranged in his dressing room by him. Not even a misaligned one would allow him to take the stage. Co-workers began to take note. His inability to quit setting things up led them to believe that he missed cues and caused sequences to be delayed. The boundary between the man and the persona became more porous. No longer was Felix merely a toy. A cage it was. Just 7 months into the reign of The Odd Couple in October 1965, Carney had hit rock bottom. He checked into a mental institution in Hartford after experiencing a complete meltdown on all fronts. He remained there for around 61 days. He came clean about everything: the breakdown, the drugs, and the drinking. "I was in a bad place," he remarked, "and my first marriage was on the rocks." Art Carney's Broadway resume was already impressive. Critics and even Tony Randall praised his performance as Felix Unger in The Odd Couple. Subsequently claimed that Carney was the superior Felix. Something terrible occurred, nevertheless, when filming the 1968 film adaptation began. Instead, Paramount cast Jack Lemmon. Billboard appeal was supposedly the driving force. However, Carney held an alternative viewpoint. He was under the impression that a large budget production wouldn't want to risk hiring him after his recent breakdown and public confession of addiction. He clung to that idea constantly. With a total of approximately $44.5 million, the picture surpassed all but 2 films that year in terms of box office take. Witnessing its success apart from him was more than just disheartening, it consumed him. Things were looking bleak before Hollywood abandoned him, though. Strange things began to be noticed by friends and co-workers. Under pressure, Carney began acting similarly to Felix Unger even when he wasn't performing. He would neatly arrange his spare change on the vanity in small piles. Rank the coins from smallest to largest, face up. It was more than eccentric, it bordered on obsession. Everyone around him understood. Once again, he was slipping. The pattern was obvious to them. He was on the verge of another collapse the more he pretended to be Felix. It grew increasingly difficult to distinguish between Carney and Felix as time went on. Afterwards, Art Carney was contacted by Jackie Gleason in 1966. As a result of his struggles with depression and substance misuse, Carney had faded from public view. Ed Norton had always been a part of Carney, but Gleason wanted him back. Remarkably, Carney made a triumphant return. Something very remarkable occurred when the reboot of The Honeymooners was broadcast on The Jackie Gleason Show. Lights went out in the fans. Norton had returned, and he was much more charming than before, with his eccentric movements, clumsy dancing, and devoted charisma. Unpredicted was Carney's exceptional talent. He received his 4th Emmy in 1966. Next came 1967 with his 5th. And then in 1968, a 6th. We won 3 Emmys in 3 years. Despite his difficulties in maintaining his composure. The program debuted musical numbers. As if nothing were amiss, Carney sang, danced, and got everyone laughing. But behind closed doors, he eventually admitted something terrifying. At the time, playing Ed Norton was more than a career booster, it was a lifesaver. At a time when his life seemed to be coming apart, the persona provided him with purpose. Despite this, nothing was hidden from view behind the scenes of the show. Carney had abandoned medication after his stint at the sanitarium. However, he was still ensnared by drink. The consequences were severe between 1966 and 1970. His look shifted abruptly. At 48 years old, he appeared much older. His hands quivered, his face bloated, and he walked more slowly. No amount of cosmetics could conceal the harm. He was taking an increasing amount of time to get ready for each scene. Carney was reportedly consuming almost 1/5 of a gallon of whiskey daily. None of that even accounts for the wine with dinner or the beers in between takes. Within a few weeks, his weight would fluctuate by 30 pounds. On occasion, he completely forgot about rehearsals. Joyce Randolph, his co-star, discovered him unconscious in his dressing room once. This was nothing new. To keep the show's impeccable reputation intact, the team figured out how to discreetly deal with these situations. Yet on the inside, things were falling apart. Most performers in Carney's situation wouldn't even contemplate what he did after the 1969 season finished. He reinitiated his stay at the Hartford Mental Institution. Absence of controversy, apprehension, or interference. He realized he was in danger, so he moved quietly and deliberately. Even though he was still very much at the top of his game and had just won another Emmy, he was drinking more than ever before. The duration of this second stay was close to 4 months. Even while he was sleeping, he was hard at work. In his psychotherapy, he immersed himself. Participating in group meetings, he helped shape Alcoholics Anonymous methodology. He maintained diaries. Using the same meticulousness he showed Norton, he dissected his own thoughts. He referred to his family's history of drunkenness as the Irish curse. Rather from being dramatic, it was meticulous. What he learned in that hospital ultimately helped him stop drinking for good in 1974, while filming Harry and Tonto, even though he didn't get sober immediately away. The honeymooners were something he still chose not to think about while he was getting well. Carney avoided any reunions, in contrast to Gleason and Audrey Meadows, who remained in touch and attended a couple. There will be no commentary, interviews, or allusions to the past. No public remark was issued by Carney upon Meadows's passing in 1996. For it, some said he was unfeeling. It wasn't about apathy, either, according to his friends and family. Survival was the main focus. He had let himself be too emotionally invested in that period of his life. Love, Alice, Audrey Meadows's memoir published in 1994, praised Carney for being both sweet and intelligent. Though she did concede that they were never really close. Whatever it was, she felt guilty for him. She speculated in an old interview that he may have held himself responsible for whatever went wrong during those challenging years of filmmaking. Her tone was sweet. Soft and melancholy, they were. She considered reaching out at a later point in her life, but ultimately decided against it. She indicated that Art had already moved on from that chapter of his life, but that mending his private life was more challenging. Art Carney believed he was receiving a second opportunity in 1966. Barbara Isaac was his second wife. He left the hospital and divorced Jean Myers a year before. She wasn't your average person. She knew what it was like to work behind the scenes in television. Carney had faith that she could maintain his composure. That looked to be the case for some time. His use of drugs came to an end. His use of amphetamines came to an end. He appeared to be a man making a fresh start, but he was still very much affected by booze. The second marriage ended in 1977. Divorce was the last nail in an already broken life. It wasn't just another one. Carney was in his golden years. While other men his age were contemplating retirement and a slower pace of life, he was falling apart. Although she had been there for him since his early days of rehabilitation in the 1960s, Barbara eventually gave up. She was confident in his abilities because of her experience working on projects like the Art Carney special. However, she had reached her breaking point and could no longer endure the unending cycles. The commitments, the intoxication, the setbacks. In 1965, their love had already weathered one storm. A further decade of deterioration would be fatal to it. Carney retreated into profound seclusion following her departure. According to his friends, he would hole up in his flat for whole weekends. As he was encircled by pill containers and empty bottles, he hardly spoke to anyone. Just staring at himself in the reflection would do it sometimes. The sight was terrifying. Reminiscent of his days as Ed Norton, this man had already brought laughter to America. He was now entirely on his own. His prior marriage's offspring also distanced themselves. They were at a loss as to how to approach the changed man he had become. Aside from being strange, Paul Mazursky's offer to star in Harry and Tonto seemed like a joke when he approached Art Carney about it. Rather from spending his life on the road with a cat, Carney had spent it making people laugh on television. On a shoestring budget of less than $1 million for an independent film. He had a small filmography consisting of 2 unremarkable features. On multiple occasions, he declined the role of a fragile 72-year-old man, describing the screenplay as an uninteresting travelogue, all because he was 54 years old. The reality was that he had aged rapidly due to years of frequent drinking, despite his claims of being too young. His balding head, graying hair, and limp from a long-ago combat injury gave him a much older appearance than he actually was. Never gave up, Mazursky. Perceiving Carney differently than others. Dealing with pain, isolation, and inner strength. The actor had the role of Carney. "Do it, you are elderly," was the stern prod he received from Bill McCaffrey, his longtime agent. My heart sank. Though harsh, it was undeniably genuine. Even Carney was aware of it. Everything almost came crashing down for him right when his big chance appeared. Carney had to lug his cat Tonto up multiple flights of stairs in one scene. He halted abruptly, knelt down, and started vomiting a black, gritty substance. No one moved. Dissolved blood from internal hemorrhage gave the impression of coffee grounds, although it was actually blood. The physical strain had set off a major event, which had its roots in the herniated diaphragm, which had been induced by years of alcohol misuse. A Los Angeles hospital was his immediate destination. "You will die in 6 months if you keep drinking," the doctors told him. Outside of the set, no one was aware of what transpired. 3 days later, Carney returned, but he appeared as pale as a ghost. Weak, pale, and trembling. In order to lessen the physical toll, the director rewrote some scenes. Carney persisted, though. After that terrifying ordeal, he felt compelled to take extreme measures. Antibus. The medicine was really harsh. He would become severely ill from even a small amount of alcohol. His pulse could quicken. Possible hours of vomiting ahead. That powerful, nevertheless, was what he required. He emptied his apartment of all bottles. Even his pals who drank began to elude him. Knowing he couldn't give in, he would occasionally stand outside liquor stores for hours, simply staring. He became protected by Antibus. He refrained from squandering his career's finest opportunity because of it. Afterwards, the unfathomable occurred. Best Actor went to Art Carney at the 1975 Oscars. Even he was taken aback. Meanwhile, Jack Nicholson was nominated for Chinatown. The Godfather Part 2's Al Pacino, Lenny's Dustin Hoffman, Murder on the Orient Express's Albert Finney, legends all. Because Nicholson was the obvious favorite, most of them even didn't bother to turn there. A gasp escaped the room as Glenda Jackson read Carney's name. Not everyone believed it. For movie legends were just defeated by a guy with only 2 small film credits. Despite this, the anguish remained. Deep scars still marked Carney. His iconic Broadway performance as Felix Unger wasn't enough to get him cast in the film adaptation of The Odd Couple years ago. In his place, the studio cast Jack Lemmon. Carney had a sneaking suspicion that the role had been lost to him due to his drinking and mental collapse. It frightened him. Anxiety and remorse continued to plague him even after the Oscar. Among his peculiar habits, his friends noticed that he always stacked coins in a specific sequence, with the largest ones at the bottom. On top of that, there were tiny ones, signals that he wasn't completely fine. Although the award did not restore his ruined reputation, it did grant him a second opportunity. Everyone was taken aback when Carney wedded Jean Myers, his first wife, in 1980. It had been 15 years since their divorce. Eileen, Brian, and Paul were born of their first marriage, which had endured for 25 years. Unfortunately, addiction had ruined it. In the middle of the 1960s, Carney admitted himself to a mental institution. Despite getting a second marriage after his divorce, it also ended in divorce. But for the sake of their children, he and Jean maintained contact. Famed actor Art Carney was uncomfortable in the limelight. He ignored the stardom that the Honeymooners bestowed upon him in the 50s and never looked back. Among the many famous faces that were absent from reunion specials that began airing in the 1970s and 1980s on television, Carney stood out. There was Jackie Gleason. Plus, Audrey Meadows was present. However, Carney consistently declined. He turned off the opportunity to earn millions. It was a wonderful time, but it was only a time was his go-to response whenever someone asked him why. The past is not a part of my life. Those close to him assured him it had nothing to do with vanity or wealth. He simply did not wish to assume the role of Ed Norton, even for a single evening. In 1957, Carney's manager had already predicted that he was prepared to take flight solo. But as time went on, it evolved into something more profound. Until you look back and see that no one turned the page, you don't know the chapter has closed, as Carney once remarked. The Honeymooners appeared to him as a closed book in that regard. What followed was even more enigmatic. Lung cancer took Audrey Meadows' life on February 3, 1996. Her age was 73. The entertainment industry was quick to respond. Many paid tribute. Various people spoke. Everybody else besides Art Carney. There is not a single sentence or quote. They were shocked. In his last interviews, even Gleason, who had passed away in 1987, had nothing but praise for his co-stars. However, Carney said nothing at all. It was characterized as frigid by some and brutal by others. However, Carney's friends and family believed there was a hidden agenda. Meadows expressed the hope that they might reunite in a future interview. In her opinion, they weren't resentful of one another. Maybe it was true what she said, that silence may be more powerful than words. Something she thought Carney was blaming himself for, but she never really said what it was. She felt bad that she had to bring up his past self because she knew it affected him. Maybe it wasn't rejection if that person remained silent. They may have felt remorse. Carney further distanced himself from the limelight after his 1975 Oscar victory for Harry and Tonto. He became sober, began anti-bus treatment, and eventually faded into obscurity, far from the limelight. Firestarter and The Muppets Take Manhattan were his only 1984 film roles, although he never again sought stardom. In 1993, he made his final picture with Last Action Hero. His last line in the film was "I'm out of here," and after that, viewers never saw him again. Carney was noticeably absent at conventions and retrospectives in contrast to other former stars. He avoided interview requests. He avoided photo ops. He hoped he would not be known as a famous actor. He preferred solitude. Following a divorce and a short second marriage, he remarried Jean, his first wife, in 1979. In Westbrook, Connecticut, they shared a home. He relished the alone, read, and gardened throughout the day. Someone he knew said he wasn't resentful. At last he had calmed down. Finding such serenity has taken decades. 5 days after becoming 85 years old, on November 9, 2003, Art Carney passed away quietly while sleeping. Biological reasons. Nothing to report. Everything is calm. A peaceful conclusion to a life that was once somewhat hectic. For nearly 30 years, he had maintained his sobriety. To avoid reversing his progress, he repeatedly used anti-bus. Like his life, his funeral was kept in privacy. He shared a grave with Jean at Old Saybrook's Riverside Cemetery. About whom 2012 might bring death. Devin Carney, his grandson, entered politics and currently serves as a member of the Connecticut General Assembly. Their legacy endured. Even though Art Carney never publicly embraced the newlyweds again, his friends and family said he accepted their decision before he passed away. Even though he never explicitly stated it, the agony had diminished. The demons had departed. A guy who had come to terms with his own mortality and was ready to depart calmly upon his own terms was all that remained.